It's a great pleasure that I have to introduce Sarah and Mark to you today. Come to from all, what is it, must be 8 miles down the road to Bakewell from there. But we're really pleased and privileged to have Sarah and Mark here today as being the coal face or quarry face of planning here in the Peak District. As I was just saying earlier, we're going to have a short presentation given by Sarah, interrupted no doubt by Mark, and then after that we're going to do some practical work. Okay, so over to you, Sarah.
Okay. This presentation is basically about the way that we tackle planning in national parks, a bit of background to Britain's national parks and how they fit into the global family of national parks, and then specifically how our planning policies in the Peak District facilitate tourism in appropriate places, which is something that I know that you'll be particularly interested in given your course. So first of all, just acknowledging that it is Valentine's Day, so if you didn't get a card this morning, I thought I'd give you all one virtually. And just an image, one of our iconic images of the national park. There'll be several of these images as I go through that just kind of give you an indication of why the Peak District is special, why it's particularly protected in law, and the kind of issues that we face as a planning service in trying to protect that for the whole country and for the world, really. So I'm just going to go through, as I've said, a global context of national parks, then a bit of a national context, then I'm going to talk specifically about planning. Mark's going to run through some case studies of real-life planning applications that have been determined by the planning service related to tourism facilities, and then we're going to do an activity for the rest of the time, till lunchtime. So in terms of a global context, every country in the world has got some form of protected area within it. And there are different reasons why areas of land are protected, and it's usually because they've got a particular ecological, archaeological, cultural or landscape value. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature is the international body that kind of categorises the level of protection given to landscape areas globally. And they have this category system that goes from category 1 to about category 7 or 8, might even go beyond that. So category 1 is basically a wilderness area like Antarctica that's completely untouched by human activity, that has special protection. If we're looking at Antarctica, nobody can stake a claim to it, and it's a true wilderness. Right at the other end of the category, we've got things like urban parks, which are protected locally and important local facilities, but don't really have that same kind of global status. The two categories that relate to national parks, as you may think of them, are category 2, which are which is the description given to, say, the national parks of North America. Think of Yosemite, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon. They're category 2 national parks. They're wilderness areas that managed mainly for ecosystem protection and tourism. People don't live there necessarily, and they are protected and conserved particularly for their ecosystem and to encourage tourism. In this country, although we call our national parks, they're not actually comparable to that level of national park on a global scale. Ours are much further down the hierarchy. We're actually category 5 protected landscapes and seascapes on a global scale. So really, in terms of that categorisation, we're not true national parks. We're protected areas managed mainly for landscape, seascape conservation or recreation. So it's a very similar description, but actually category 5 acknowledges that people live and work in our national parks and that they are managed landscapes. They're not protected purely for ecosystem conservation. In terms of national parks in the UK, most of you will be familiar with the distribution of national parks, particularly if you've done geography at A-level or GCSE. This is something that's usually covered. Peak District is the oldest national park in the UK. It was created as a national park in 1951. Some of you might be aware of the history of national parks. There's quite an interesting social history. And the movement to form national parks came about just before and during the Second World War, when people from the bigger cities really started to put pressure on government to have access to areas of natural beauty. Because not long ago in the past, these areas were owned by rich landowners, by farmers, and people didn't have the right to walk across the land or to enjoy the landscape. So that culminated in the mass trespass onto Kinder Scout in the 1930s, 1940s, and then eventually the first national park, Peak District National Park, was designated in 1951. Does anyone know what the newest of the UK's national parks is, the most recent designation from that list? No? South Downs, they were given their national park status in about 2010, I think it was finally confirmed. So that's the area, don't turn this off, that's this area here. And they knocked us off the top spots in terms of population, because we used to be the national park with far and away the highest population, but now their population is 4 or 5 times what we've got in the Peak District. So they have a different planning system to cope with the population that lives in the South Downs.
Sarah, could I just ask when the South Downs applied to become designated as a national park?
Their original application dates back to the same time as all the other national parks, so back in the 1940s, 1950s. So it took 60 years before they were actually formally designated as a national park. And that's partly because of all the problems associated with the number of local authorities involved and the number of towns that exist in that area. Now this is quite an important slide, and something that's important for you to recognise, that our national parks are actually protected in law. There's a different level of protection for national parks than for any other open space in the UK. And in that law, there are stated that there are 2 purposes stated. So the purposes of the national parks in the UK are to conserve and enhance the natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage of the area, and secondly, to promote opportunities for the understanding and enjoyment of the park's special qualities by the public. And that's probably the one that you're most interested in, because that relates directly to tourism. So that's one of the legal purposes, the statutory purposes of the national parks, is to promote tourism. I don't think there are any other areas in the UK where that's actually a legal obligation. And then alongside that, there is a duty, which is slightly lower status, and the duty is to foster the economic and social well-being of the communities within the national park. So again, that's recognition that in the UK, people live in the national park and have it as their home and employment area. Now, particularly in the planning system, sometimes we'll deal with applications where either those purposes will conflict with each other, or the duty will conflict with one of the purposes. And in those instances, there's an important concept called the Stanley Principle, which means that landscape always takes priority. So if you were to put in a planning application for a 200-bed hotel that was really going to boost tourism, and it had an attached visitor centre that explained all about the geology of the national park, so it met that purpose about promoting understanding and enjoyment, but it damaged the landscape, that application would be refused because landscape always takes priority.
Sarah, could you just clarify that third point about the duty? When was that added to the national park? It wasn't there at the beginning, was it?
No, it's reasonably recent. It was in the 90s.
Yeah.
I think probably early 90s.
I think that.
Yeah, the Environment Act is from 1995, and that introduced the duty for the first time. So before that, actually the communities were kind of ignored and sidelined a little bit.
But when we talk in the lectures and in the literature quite a lot about this triple bottom line, and that brings in those two, the social and the economic one, whereas previously it had just really been the environment. What we've been saying is that when we talk about sustainability, historically it's been all about the landscape, whereas more recently we now talk about economic and social.
Yeah. And that fits in directly with national planning policy about sustainable development, where you've got three strands of economy, environment and social well-being. So just now moving on to the Peak District National Park specifically, this photograph gives you a pretty good idea of why the national park exists. This is a photo of the national park with Sheffield in the background. And the Peak District is probably the most pressured of the national parks in terms of the pressure for development, the pressure for second homes, because we're enclosed on all sides by urban development. So we've got Sheffield, we've got Leeds, Manchester, Stoke, Derby, all kind of closing in on the national park from all sides, which is why the Peak District is particularly special and it's particularly important to protect this area, because of course it was designated as the breathing space for the workers from those cities.
So I don't know whether it's me, but whenever I see that picture, I just think what a wonderful caption competition that would be. You know, you can look at that and think of so many different captions that you could do if you could come up with. You know, well, it says we should be whatever there on the map, and this is where we're going to build our house or something. It just cries out for a caption to be put on there somewhere.
And it shows really clearly as well that the national park is almost a line on the map. So on one side of that line we've got the moorlands and we've got this kind of semi-wilderness, and on the other side we've got massive urban sprawl and development. So I've already said we were the first national park. We're about 1,500 square kilometres, which is kind of a middle-sized national park in the UK, but in terms of global national parks it's pretty tiny. Some of England's finest climbing, caving, walking and cycling, which is what draws the tourists in particularly. Second most visited national park in the world apparently. That figure is bandied around. I don't know how much evidence there is for it, but does anybody know what the most visited national park in the world is?
Yes, I do.
I think it's one in Japan.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's Mount Fuji in Japan, which again, I suppose has quite a lot of similarities to the Peak District in that it's very close to Tokyo. So it gets a lot of day trips, a lot of day visitors, which is why the Peak District is the second most visited, because we're enclosed by those urban areas. So we get 18 to 22 million day visits per year, but compared to that, only 2.5 million overnight stays. That statistic is completely different to all the other national parks in the UK, which are a bit more remote. So if you looked at the Lake District, for example, that figure's probably reversed. They probably get more overnight stays than they do day trips. And that's important for the local tourist economy because it means it's catering for a completely different type of tourism. 16 million people live within 1 hour's travel time of the national park. We've got nearly 3,000 listed buildings and over 100 conservation areas. Again, compared to the Lake District, that's about 3 or 4 times what they've got. So there are pretty tough constraints on planning and what you can do with buildings in the Peak District even compared to the other national parks. And also we've got areas that are protected under European and national legislation and wider international legislation. Triple SIs, Sites of Special Scientific Interest, SACs, Special Areas of Conservation, SPAs, Special Protection Areas. The latter of those two relate to bird life. So there's areas that are not only protected by the Environment Act, but are protected under separate legislation as well.
Sarah, we've been talking quite a lot about HS2. Does that affect the Peak District at all?
It shouldn't. The route that's being proposed at the moment shouldn't, but who knows where it'll actually end up. It was something that the National Park were concerned about a couple of years ago when the route was first put forward.
Because they're talking about going to Sheffield, aren't they, to Meadowhall and also to Manchester. Well, neither of those, as you pointed out on your map there, Sheffield is very close to the Peak District National Park. So do you have any input into that process? Have you had any input into that process?
As far as I know, not at our level. But we would be statutory consultee on the final plans for that. So we would be consulting and we would be able to put our views forward. Oh, right, I missed an important point there. National Park is also home to 38,000 people. Like I said, the South Downs is now bigger than us in terms of population. They've got about 250,000. And the local economy is based on tourism, obviously, farming, quarrying and manufacturing. Out of all the national parks, we're the most industrial. We've got quite a significant industrial legacy in terms of quarries, cement works, and that kind of thing. So we've got quite a lot of brownfield land in the national park. So how is planning in national parks different to planning anywhere else? We, as the National Park Authority, are the local planning authority. And we cut across the boundaries of other local authorities. So here in Buxton, the planning is done by High Peak for a council. Once you reach the edge of the national park, although some areas are still within High Peak, we deal with their planning applications. And that system was set up to remove the politics from decision making in planning and to give consistent planning decisions from right at the north of the park right down to the south of the park. So that makes us very different to anywhere else, and it does lead to some tension with what we call our constituent authorities, because we cut across the boundary of about 10 other local authorities, and we effectively have planning powers in their areas.
So just to clarify that, we're saying that you take precedence over these 10 other authorities. The people that make up those other authorities are elected by the local people, whereas you, as having that power higher than that, aren't elected, you are appointed.
Well, there's
Could you just explore that
yeah,
a little bit, please?
That's more in terms of our representation. If you were a standard local authority, all the people who actually make up the planning committee or make a decision on finances are local councillors who are elected by the local population. They're politicians, and they get the final say in terms of whether to approve or refuse a planning application or to finance education or housing or whatever. In the national park, we're a bit different. 50% of our members, as we call them, approximately 50%, are politicians, and they're politicians within each of the authorities that we cut across the boundaries of. The other 50%, just less than 50%, aren't politicians at all. They're appointed by the Secretary of State for the Environment because they've got a particular skill or a particular background or specific knowledge about something. So, for example, some of our members are archaeologists, or they might be retired chief executives of local authorities. So they understand something about the way national parks work, or something that's particularly important about the national park. So again, that takes some of the politics out of decision making. We've still got politicians on our membership, but they're not the only people making decisions. Some of the people making decisions are technically neutral in terms of their political stance. That makes us very different to a standard local authority.
When the Secretary of State changes in a government, do those people that have been appointed have to, can they will continue, or are they likely to be replaced, or?
They're appointed for a set term regardless of the government changes. And then after that set term, they either have to stand down or reapply. So we get quite a rapid turnover of people on our membership. Other things that make us different, I don't know if you realise that in planning, people have permitted development rights. So if you own a house, you can put some extensions on it without actually needing planning permission. You always have been able to. There was a big hoo-ha in the media a couple of months ago about the government proposing to change it slightly so you could put bigger extensions on your house without planning permission, and that was badged as, we're taking decision making off local authorities. You're going to be able to do this without permission for the first time ever. Actually, you've always been able to put an extension on your house up to a certain size limit without planning permission, as long as you don't live in a listed building. But in the national park, those rights are slightly reduced. So whereas if you had a house in Buxton, you might be able to put an extension on the side of it without permission. In the national park, you can't put an extension on the side of your house without planning permission. So permitted development rights are reduced. They still exist, but they're more stringent. We've also got tighter controls over signage like adverts, overhead cables and wind turbines. And we have very stringent design requirements. We've got a design guide that basically sets out what materials you're allowed to use and what kind of style you're allowed to put buildings, develop buildings in. So that's a little bit different. So for example, if you have a stone cottage in Bakewell, you're not going to be allowed to put a red brick extension next to it. And as I've said earlier, consideration of national park purposes in all decisions is crucial. So we've got an extra layer of legislation compared to planners elsewhere in the country. National park planning policy is quite similar to planning policy anywhere else in the country, but again with a few little added bonuses. So you may have heard talk in the media, particularly last year and the year before, about the new national policy for planning. The National Trust objected to its original draft very strongly, and it was all over the papers for a couple of weeks. It's now been adopted. It's called the National Planning Policy Framework. It was very controversial because it condensed about 2,500 pages of guidance down to 50 pages, 52 pages, and it prioritises and promotes sustainable economic development. And at one time we thought that was going to be a real threat to the national parks because it effectively meant, as a planning authority, we would be under an obligation to approve any application for economic development. The way that it was changed after the first draft was issued has meant that that's no longer the case, so it's not as bad as we thought. There are also, at national level, there are things that we call circulars, which give guidance on particular planning issues. There's a National Park and Norfolk Broad circular, which relates specifically to the national parks. And then at a local level, we've got our Peak District National Park Local Plan, which you're going to be looking at some of the policies in that during the activities. And also our local development framework, where we've got the core strategy. We've adopted a core strategy. So those documents are really important because any decision we make has to refer back to policies in those documents. And the policies in there relate to tourism, housing, farming, quarrying, infrastructure. So any issue that you can think of in terms of planning will probably have a policy within one of those documents. And if what you're proposing is contrary to a policy, then in all likelihood the application will be refused. Then on an even more detailed level, we've got supplementary planning documents like our design guide, our guide to affordable housing and our guide to agricultural development. We're just about to issue our new guidance on renewable energy technologies as well. And then we've got another layer of information that we have to be aware of. In planning terms, they're called material considerations, things that can be taken into account when we're making a planning decision. And that includes the National Park Management Plan, the landscape strategy, and our conservation area appraisals. So every time Mark makes a decision on a planning application, he has to review every single one of those documents, even if it's just because somebody wants to put a porch on the front of their house. He has to work out where that application fits into all that legislation and policy. So these are some examples of the types of policies we have for tourism in the Peak District. We have general recreation policies. We've got policies about hotels, bed and breakfasts, self-catering accommodation, which you'll be able to have a look at in a bit. Caravans and camping, again, one of the applications I'm going to give you to look at relates to a caravan site. And then in our local plan, there are caravan site policies, restrictions on holiday occupancy of self-catering accommodation. Usually people aren't allowed to stay in holiday accommodation for more than 28 days because there's a risk after that it actually becomes a house. And we have very tight controls over residential development in the National Park. There's one of our biggest tourist attractions in the National Park. Does anyone know where that is? Yes, it's Chatsworth. That attracts millions of visitors to the National Parks, not far from Bakewell. So Bakewell picks up a lot of tourism and trade on the back of Chatsworth. And there was a documentary series about it at the end of last year. It was quite interesting. So what kind of planning applications do we deal with that relate to tourism? Well, caravan sites, camping, holiday cottages, general facilities like tea shops, souvenir shops, car parking, hotels, guest houses, recreational routes like the Monsall Trail, which opened in the last couple of years, High Peak Trail, Tissington Trail, and development on large estates, Haddon Hall, Chatsworth, Tissington, Lyme Park. They're all within the National Park, so anything that they want to do to promote tourism, they have to come to us for permission to do that. So what do we do when we get an application? How do we actually go about making a decision on it? Well, hopefully, before people put in applications, they've actually had a discussion with us about what we want to see, what we're going to expect, and that's called pre-application discussions. And when people have pre-application discussions, generally the application is much more likely to be approved than if somebody just puts a planning application in without talking to us about it first. We've got to decide what kind of application it is. Does it require an environmental impact assessment? Does it relate to a listed building? Is it in a conservation area? And that affects the amount of time that it takes us to actually issue a decision. Generally, 8 weeks. We get a planning application, we've got 8 weeks to deal with it, and then we have to give someone the answer within 2 months. If it's a major development, then we get 13 weeks. If it's got environmental impact assessment attached to it, we get 16 weeks. Within that period, 21 days, we can't do anything really. We can't issue a decision because it goes out to consultation. So we have to put up a site notice to inform people of the application, neighbours get a letter, parish councils get a letter, and then they all have 21 days to actually make comments or object to it, support it or whatever. Then we assess it against all that policy, against all the material considerations and against our legal obligations. As we've said, if there's conflict between those purposes, then landscape takes priority under the Stanley Principle. And we very rarely just say approve something without putting what we call conditions on it. So almost every planning application, if it's approved, will have a condition on that says you've got to carry out the development within 3 years. It'll say you've got to carry out the development in accordance with the plans that you've submitted. It'll say you've got to carry out the development in a particular way in terms of the materials that are used. And then there can be other conditions attached to it. Major applications can have up to 70, 80 conditions attached to them. And they might relate to working hours, delivery times, anything that relates to planning really. Simple ones, you might only have 3 conditions. And then in some circumstances, we also require a legal agreement. So particularly for affordable housing, we actually have a legal agreement that says that only local people can live in a house that's been given planning permission. And then sometimes I can just issue the decision. So Mark would give me a report that he's written and I would decide whether I agree with it or not, and then we'd either approve or refuse the planning application. More controversial planning applications where we've got a lot of objections or the parish council want to do something different to what we do, it has to go to committee. And as I've said, the committee is made up of some politicians and some people who've been appointed by the Secretary of State. And then I have to go along one Friday a month, put forward my case to the planning committee as to whether something should be approved or refused, and then committee take a vote. And we're going to be recreating that in the activity later. So some of you are going to pretend to be the planning committee and actually decide whether to approve or refuse applications. And then if you get a refusal, you've actually got a right of appeal. You can go and appeal to the planning inspectorate just as you can in any other local authority area in the country.
Sarah, could you just explain what you mean by affordable housing? Because I'm not sure that's something that everyone in the room will understand.
Yeah, affordable housing is a concept where housing is provided specifically for local people on low incomes. If you think about the pressure that we have for housing in the national park, we're very close to Manchester, Sheffield, and all the other cities I've mentioned. It's a very attractive place for richer people to buy second homes or to buy big houses and then commute to work. So that pushes up average property prices in the national park. Now when you think that the majority of people in the national park are employed in things like quarrying and agriculture, which have relatively low wages, the majority of local people born and bred in the national park can't actually afford to buy a house, even a little house. The average price of a 2-bedroom terrace house is probably about £220,000. So most people can't get onto the property ladder. And in the past, that's led to out-migration from the park. So people have had to move away to actually be able to afford to buy a house or rent a house. So we have policies that mean that some houses can be built, but they have to be restricted so that only people who've lived in the national park for 10 years or more, and only people who can prove that they can't afford a mortgage to buy a house on the open market can live in it. And then they're not allowed to sell it on to people who don't meet that criteria. So what you end up with is a house that's worth about 30% less than the open market value of it. Now sometimes those houses will be controlled by registered social landlords who rent it out at an affordable rent. So it's a method of actually ensuring that local people can afford to stay in the same village that they've been born in, the same village that their parents live in. So it's one way that we can try to alleviate the problem of second homes and commuter homes.
You say it's a concept. Has it been successful? Is it successful? Or has it just put builders off from wanting to do a development because you put this appendage on, yes, we'll allow you planning permission, but you've got to do so many affordable houses. How's it worked?
It's been relatively successful. It's been in place probably for nearly 20 years now, or more than that in one form or another. It still doesn't provide us with enough homes for the amount of demand there is. There's always more demand than the number of homes that can actually be provided. It is very unattractive for commercial developers. Commercial developers generally won't build affordable houses, so it's usually the housing associations or local people themselves that actually build these houses. So very small numbers at any one time.
Thank you.
And there's just another picture of one of our big tourist attractions. That's Dovedale, which is right down in the south of the park, one of the major attractions for walkers and day trippers. It's quite close to Tissington and to Ireland, to Ashbourne. And now I'll pass over to Mark. He's going to talk about some case studies of applications that he's had some involvement with for tourist development.
Hi. Yeah, I'm going to look at a couple of case studies. Two of them are camping ones. I've tried to pick ones that are fairly new, I guess, certainly to the park. One of them is for these camping pods, which are relatively recent to the elevation, and then I'll go on to look at some glamping tents as well. So this is the first application, which is at Groden campsite, which is it's an established site in the park already. There's about 45 pitches on there for touring caravans and tents. They've got amenity blocks and things like that as well. And the applicant wanted to add 10 of these camping pods onto the site in order to attract more people, and it also extends the year for them as well, because people can stay in these when it's a bit colder and they camp just by rolling up with a tent. So the campsite's been there for quite a while. It's actually established in the 70s when it was identified through a local survey that there was a need for affordable tourist accommodation in the area for walkers. Obviously that's something that we'd assess on any application from a tourism point of view, whether there's actually a demand in the first place. So I'll just go back again. The design of the pods on the site was very similar to the ones that you can see here. So they're about 3.5 metres long, 2.5 wide, about 2.5 high as well. And then they're just accessed within the existing site just with sort of wood chip paths. Because they're a relatively recent innovation, they're not addressed just specifically in the policies that the park has. So they kind of fall between tents and static caravans in terms of how they can be interpreted. In legal definition, it's been identified previously that they're classed as caravans. And in this instance, the officer looked at them and said, well, we've got to accord them with static caravans because they're there all the time and don't move. Static caravans are addressed within the policies of the National Park, and they're generally unacceptable. And that's because of the scale of them, the form of them, and the materials. They're very hard to blend into the landscape in a way that's going to be sympathetic and not be detrimental to its character. As Sarah's already talked about, though, we've also got the duty to encourage and promote understanding and enjoyment of the park. Now, obviously, anything that provides affordable accommodation to people who perhaps might not really have either the equipment to camp or just the inclination for normal camping, these do help fulfil that statutory purpose. So that's another consideration that the officer who dealt with this had to make. In terms of the other considerations, the officer had to look at the landscape impact that these were going to have on the site. You can see it's fairly open countryside. We're not in the middle of a town or a village or anything like that. But it's an established campsite, so there's already development there, there's already activity, there's already cars going, people there. So it's not an isolated site as it would be if these were just being put in the open countryside. On top of that, you can see it's pretty heavily wooded. And obviously out of season here, so there's no leaves or anything on the trees, but ordinarily, throughout the season would be used mostly. They're quite well screened by the trees as well. So based on this, the officer made the recommendation that this application should be approved. And this application did go to the planning committee, which was the system Sarah was discussing, where the case is particularly controversial, particularly large, or in this case, it's just relatively new. It's not covered specifically in policy. And so what the officer was recommending was really an exception to that policy that deals with static caravans, because we're saying this should be accepted. The policy saying static caravans aren't. And so it went to the planning committee for their decision. In this instance, the committee took a vote and they agreed with the planning officer, and this was approved. It's an exception to policy on the basis that it didn't have any adverse impact on the wider landscape, and had only a very small impact on the local area. And so they had to balance that as well with the statutory duty to protect and enhance the park.
Mark, is it likely that you say that it's a new innovation, it's not in these, is it likely that it will be put in?
Yeah, I think it will. The policies obviously have a lifespan. We have a policy team who, as these things come up, they're aware of them. We as development control teams have discussions with them. So when cases like these come in,
because it's so different to a static caravan, which is big, metal, white, shiny.
Absolutely.
To have something
that's
like
right.
That's no more obtrusive than a pig pen, really.
Yeah. But at the same time, you can't consider them to be a tent because they are permanent fixed to the ground, so they fall in between the two things really. But yeah, the policies do evolve. As I say, these are really quite recently, it's over the last few years that we've started to see them come about, and as the policies get updated, I'm sure that they will cover these sorts of structures as well. So that was relatively straightforward. The next one is a place called Winslow House, which is in Dovedale Valley. This is a farm, as you can see here from the pictures. These are existing farm buildings. And the proposal was to put 7 glamping tents on these 2 sites here. For anyone not familiar with glamping, it's essentially luxurious camping. So you turn up at the campsite, there's a large tent already erected for you. It's normally got a bed in it, a stove, often heating, and sometimes you've got electric in them as well. So it's essentially, you're almost staying in an apartment, but it's canvas. So that's what was proposed here. The design of the proposed tents, they're quite large, so they're 9 metres long, 5 metres wide, and about 3.5 metres high. They were to be coloured in a recessive colour so that they weren't intrusive in the landscape. And this shows the siting. So these are the buildings that you can see on the last photograph. They wanted to put 2 down here with some new tree planting around here to help screen the landscape, and the cover up there. And then this section here is just a little bit further down this road, and they had 3 set into woodland there as well. And so as we do the application, the officer had to consider the landscape impact that they were going to have, and how that fits in within the local policies. The local policies stipulate that the development's got to respect, conserve, and where possible enhance that landscape. And so that's how the judgment is made on the landscape impact, whether it is considered as a minimum to maintain the landscape as it is, to not have any detrimental impact at all. The case officer took the view that, subject to this establishing here, this planting, that actually they were well screened from public views, and they weren't going to have a detrimental impact. Further to that, they were only temporary. They were fixed on the site for the season, but they'd be there from, I think it was January through till November, and then in the winter they'd be taken away. So obviously that reduces the impact for some of the year at least. So based on that assessment, the officer made the recommendation that these ones were also approved. And again, it went to committee because these types of structures are quite new to the park. In this instance, though, the committee disagreed with the officer, and they said that actually the landscape impact of these is going to be detrimental to the Peak District National Park. These 2 particularly, they attended a site visit before the committee meeting, and there's a footpath that runs just out of the shop here. And they said from that particular viewpoint, they're going to be visible, and they're not in keeping with the rural landscape that's there at the moment. So whilst it's only a very small site, and from all of the viewpoints, they're not really going to be very visible, the committee's view was that that's still detrimental to the character of the landscape of the park, even if it's only for some of the year, and even if it's only quite small. So it goes to show how sensitive development is in the park. Very small things can have, or can be considered to have, quite a large impact. And based on that, the committee refused it and said the application couldn't go ahead. Really, I've included this second application to show that planning, it's not a specific process that will only lead to one outcome. You've got policies there, but they're always going to be interpretation by both the officers and the committee if those decisions are going to committee as well. And so it's something that whenever you might be dealing with a planning application or putting one in, you're going to look at policies and try and fit within those, but there's always going to be room for interpretation within those policies. And as Sarah said, we always hope that people will come and have pre-application advice with us, so that people don't look at a policy and interpret it how they think it should be applied, only to come to make an application and find that actually the park's taking a different view on it. So I've included one more case today, and this one's a fairly small case with regards to advertising signage. Now, any tourism business that's establishing itself in the park is likely to need to advertise itself. Tourism particularly, because they're going to rely an awful lot on passing trade, particularly for day activities, riding centres, things like that. And the park's sympathetic to that. We do try and encourage sustainable tourism wherever we can, but at the same time, that needs to respect the area that it's in, and that's going to vary in different parts of the park. This was simply replacement signage for a pub, which is fairly straightforward really. Generally, we were quite happy with what was submitted on the application. The colours were fairly neutral, the signs were kept simple, they respected the character of the property. There were a few instances where, where some signage was changed, so that was what was proposed on the left-hand side there. Dominates the wall quite strongly. This is quite a narrow street running past here, and it really just dominated the view of that street. So simply by changing it to something that's just reversed out, it just makes it a bit more sensitive to its area. It's those kinds of small details that can make quite a difference to how an application is viewed. Obviously, in this instance, signage around here is not going to be too much of a problem. It's a rural area, but it's a village location, and as a result of that, you'd expect there to be signs. You expect you've got road signs and things around anyway. You've got other buildings. It doesn't look out of place. However, if you try and set this level of signage and apply it to a riding centre, which might be an old converted field barn in the middle of the countryside, and you covered it with 7, 8 signs with signs on the road and things, that's not going to be anywhere near as likely to be acceptable. So it's really, I just put this one in to give an example of how you need to adapt any sort of promotion that you're doing on site to the location that you're in. And that's it for the base of this.
Mark, I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah.
First of all, one of the popular trends seems to be the erection of yurts through different areas, which is completely out of character with the Peak District because they come from Mongolia or somewhere, these big circular tents. What's your view on those?
I suppose that's going to be quite similar to these glamping tents. Any sort of temporary tourism structure like that for accommodation, it's not going to be traditional to the park. They're all much more recent than the stone-built buildings, even modern tents. And we're happy to accommodate campsites within the park where they're dealt with, where they're sited, where they're not going to have a huge landscape impact, but it's getting no immediate impact for anybody else around there as well. And a lot of the time, these tents are very brightly coloured, and so their impact actually might be more than a yurt, even though they're only seasonal. So it's one of those, again, it's not covered by policy at the moment, but if it's sensitively cited, there are instances where we consider them acceptable. By the same token, if you have a field that's fairly exposed and you have a large number of them, it's really to do with size and location, and it's case by case really on those.
Okay. The other question I've got is that we've looked at the case studies that have been hard buildings and what have you, but I know that in the Peak District we have several pop festivals which are, shall shall we say, there are events and different things. What involvement would you have with the planning of an event that's not actually a hard
So
thing?
very short term.
Well, I think it's the Why Not Festival. Is that in the Peak District? Do you have any involvement with
There's
that?
a big one at Pike Hall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Why Not
Is that the one?
Yeah.
As local planning authority, we're consulted on the licensing applications for those kind of festivals. But because what they're doing is so time limited, it doesn't actually need planning permission.
Right.
So it's really, we just act as a consultee on licensing.
So would that be the same for like hotels and function places where they have like marquees or domes in them?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, marquees are a little bit tricky. Some places just put them up for 2 days rather than a wedding, and then they disappear. And in that case, they don't need permission from us. There was quite a controversial application before I started at the National Park where they wanted to put up a marquee at Lyme Park for weddings, and that was going to be there for like 9-10 months of the year. And that was a bit more difficult because then you do need planning permission. It's counted as a permanent structure, and so they have to apply to us. And because in that instance it was surrounded by listed buildings, that was actually refused because it was felt to be inappropriate. But there are, like Tissington Hall has a semi-permanent marquee for weddings, and that got approval because it was in the right location and it's well hidden. So it just depends how long it's going to be there for and what size it is. And, yeah.